Well, most of the research I've done has been in the philosophy of art and the nature of beauty, things like that. I liked philosophy, I liked art, so it seemed a natural way to go. I've also done some research in the philosophy of mind and ethics more generally.
Well, I'm the Professor of Philosophy at the OU, and I research philosophy of various kinds, in particular two things, ethics and ancient philosophy. And I got interested in them in both those areas really when I was about 14, and I found a book in the school library which was called The Apology of Socrates, and that was Socrates' speech in his own defence in a courtroom in Athens in 399 BC, and it's all about how Socrates was not actually corrupting the youth as he was accused of doing. He was giving them a good education, he was teaching them things that mattered, and he wasn't denying the gods either, because he had particular beliefs of his own which weren't quite orthodox, but he wasn't denying the gods. So I got really gripped by the Apology of Socrates, and I got really gripped by Plato, and that was the beginning of my interest in both ancient philosophy and also ethics. Well, right now I'm working on what I see as a gap in the way that we do moral philosophy today, the way we do ethics today, and that's a gap in the area of what I call epiphanies. So people have, in ordinary life, maybe not in academic philosophy, but in ordinary life, people have these amazing experiences where they see something really beautiful or they work out something particularly mind-blowing, and they say, wow, that's a wow moment, that's a peak experience in my life, and I really learn something from that. It changes the way I think, it changes what I value, it changes what I'm trying to do. And if you look at novels and films, they're full of this kind of stuff. And academic philosophy isn't full of that kind of stuff. So I want to write about epiphanies, to try and get academic philosophers like myself to focus on these peak experiences, these special moments where we learn something about what's really valuable to us, what's important to us, and it sets us off in a completely new direction.
The interest in power comes from probably the fact that my background, as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate, was sociology and politics, not geography. Now, I'm now an economic geographer, but effectively I put the two together. I put space, place and distance together with power, domination and authority, because those things are talked about in a more rigorous way in sociology and politics. So I just was at the right time, right place. But what emotionally got me involved? When I was much younger, when I was 18, I hitchhiked across Africa. Well, I say hitchhiked because not roads in all places of Africa, but made my way through from Cairo to Cape. And as an 18-year-old, you came across arbitrary violence and authority you weren't quite sure of the backgrounds to. And there were forms of ways of acting and being that I hadn't come across before that kind of frightened me, but also made me realise that the kinds of power you see exercised at home in London, the civilised veneer, isn't the only kind. And I got interested from there, really.
I'm interested broadly in food and agriculture, and coffee, believe it or not, led me to it. I started my work in a coffee growing region of India, and coffee is usually a crop that's grown in two very different ways. One is a sun coffee, where all the shade trees are stripped off, and the other is shade coffee, where forest trees are kept overhead of coffee plants to provide the shade. And so I discovered that shade coffee is much more environmentally sustainable form of coffee cultivation. And so that led me to think more broadly about sustainable ways of producing food and doing agriculture. I grew up at the foothills of the Western Ghats Mountains in southwest India, and I have always been interested in the forests because these hills are covered in forests. Along the line, I discovered a fascinating coffee growing area about 1,000 miles from where I grew up, and this is where I decided to do my doctorate research, because this area is fascinating for its cultural traditions around forests and wildlife, but also the environmentally sustainable forms of agricultural production that people here practice. The research that I do takes me to exotic locations in tropical parts of the world, and I have done research in coffee growing parts of southwest India, which are very close to the forests, and so the planters who live there and cultivate coffee are very close to nature and wildlife. They encounter some fascinating wildlife. Elephants travel through the coffee plantations to get from one part of forest to another. A fascinating diversity of birds nest in trees that are providing shade to coffee plants. There are also leopards who use the plantations to hunt for their prey. And so I have heard some remarkable stories of wildlife during my research, and I have come across some of that wildlife myself.
My area of research is personal finance, and there are two strands to that. The first is the relationship between individual financial capability and the wider economic, social and political context. And the second strand is the role of consumers in retail financial markets. So in particular, how consumers can have power in those markets, and also the extent to which they can reasonably be expected to drive competition. I got into this area of research because earlier in my career I worked for the UK's main consumer body, and after that became freelance. So I was doing research in both those roles, either aimed at empowering consumers or at influencing public policy. And so my research at the Open University is an extension of that.